America feels like it's breaking. The media blames culture wars, gender, race, politics, but beneath the noise, there's a deeper fracture. While millions of Americans struggle to just get by, a small elite has steadily reshaped the country's institutions to serve their interests. If you divided America by how much wealth each group owns, it would look like this. The poorest 20%, tens of millions of people, would own just enough to fill a single state, Arizona. The next 60%, America's middle class, would stretch just across the rest of the West Coast from Washington to California. The wealthiest 20% would own everything else, and within that, the richest 1% alone would own enough wealth to cover the entire East Coast. It wasn't always like this. America once promised upward mobility, but over the past 4 decades, the income of the top 1% has skyrocketed by 574%, multiplying their wealth nearly 6 times. Meanwhile, the bottom 20% have seen their incomes jump by just 30%, barely outpacing inflation. Today it's common to romanticize a golden age of America. Trump practically won an election, promising to bring it back. But are people really longing for a time of racial segregation and lower wages? Or are they desperate for a society where they once again feel like they have a fair shot? Because inequality isn't just about money, it's about power, about who gets to shape the rules and who is left behind. And over time, that inequality has quietly eaten away at the very foundation of American society, turning the American dream into a distant memory. So, how did it get this bad? And can it still be saved? Here's how America got to its breaking point. To understand how inequality in America became what it is today, we need to go back to what many consider to be the golden age of the United States, the 1950s. For millions, the American dream was finally becoming a reality. It was a time of new cars, sprawling suburbs, and of course economic growth. In the 2 decades following the Second World War, the US economy doubled in size. For context, that's a similar rate of growth to what we are seeing in China today. And here's the thing, this wasn't just money going to the rich. The explosion in economic growth came hand in hand with falling inequality. By the 1940s, the share of income going to the country's top 10% had fallen to the lowest level in a century. The country's middle class was rapidly expanding, and by the 1960s, 60% of Americans were considered middle class, up from 30% in the 1930s. Citizens filled their homes with new consumer products. TVs, cars, washing machines, once luxuries only the rich could enjoy, were now available to everyone. And while the country was far from perfect, the trend was clear. For most Americans, life was slowly getting better. Capitalism was working as an engine of prosperity for all, and when the economy grew, everybody benefited. But, as the saying goes, nothing good lasts forever, and this is exactly what happened to America. By the early 1980s, things were beginning to change. A new school of economic thinking began to dominate the political landscape, neoliberalism. The idea was simple: reduce the size of government and allow the free market to unleash its full creative potential by cutting back on regulations and taxes. The thinking was that the wealth generated by the system would gradually trickle down to the rest of society, lifting everyone up in the process. And when Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1981, that's exactly what he did. The top income tax rate, which had hovered around 70% for decades, was slashed to just 30%. Trade barriers were dismantled, markets were deregulated, and globalization was championed, all sold on the idea that economic growth would make everybody better off. And, for a while, it worked. At least on paper. Since the 1980s, the US has enjoyed the fastest rate of economic growth in the developed world. At the start of the neoliberal revolution, the average US citizen made about $12,000 more than the average European. But by 2023, this gap had almost tripled, growing to $31,000. But there was a problem. For the first time in nearly a century, income inequality also began to rise. Suddenly, economic growth no longer meant rising living standards for ordinary Americans. From the 1940s all the way through to the 70s, the bottom 90% of earners saw huge increases in their incomes. But from the 1970s, their incomes remained totally stagnant. So where did all the growth go? mostly to the rich. Over the same period, the top 1% of earners saw huge increases in their pay. The middle class, once considered the backbone of the American economy, began to slowly vanish. But here's the thing, all of the indicators that are used to show economic success were still going up. The country's GDP was rising fast, tripling in size from the 1980s to today, and the stock market kept going, increasing by over 1,400% in half a lifetime. Even unemployment, often a barometer for the livelihoods of those on lower incomes, remained low. But the reality was that under the surface, the quality of life for the average American had remained totally stagnant for decades. Capitalism, once thought of as a system guaranteed to improve the lives of everybody, had totally failed. This is a really important topic, so I decided not to take a sponsor for this video. Instead, I wanted to quickly tell you about our new Instagram page. We're posting short daily explainers on economics, geopolitics, and how the world really works. If you've liked the video so far, consider giving it a follow. It really helps us, and more importantly, it gets more people into these topics. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. Now, back to the video. America was built on a promise that no matter who you were or where you started, you could build a better life. But today, that idea seems to be slipping out of reach. Today, somebody born into the bottom 10% of US earners has only a 7% chance of making it into the top 10%. By comparison, an American born in the 1940s had a 90% chance of earning more than their parents. But for the generation born in the 1980s, that number had shrunk to just 50%. The country that once led the world in opportunity has become one of the hardest places to climb the ladder. Of course, this crisis hasn't gone unnoticed. In 2024, reducing the level of inequality pled as the second most important issue for the president to address. But here's the thing, for most issues, gaining enough public support is practically a guarantee of some government action. Enough people wanted civil rights legislation, the government produced the Civil Rights Act. Demands for climate change in the 2000s produced the Paris Climate Accord. And calls for healthcare eventually led to Obamacare. But inequality is different. No matter how much pressure the public puts on politicians, nothing seems to be done. Take this chart for example. It shows what average Americans think the ideal distribution of wealth should be. The top 20% of the population does own a significantly larger share of the country's wealth, about 30%, but the wealth is also distributed across all income groups. Even the poorest 20% hold around 10% of the nation's assets. Then compare it to the actual wealth distribution. Almost all of the country's wealth goes to the top 20%, and the bottom 20% own such a small share that you can hardly even see them. This disconnect is fueling a growing sense of outrage over the level of inequality in America. So why isn't anything being done? It all comes down to who actually has the power. Just take a look at President Trump's inauguration. This was one of the most high-profile events in decades. Presidents and prime ministers from all around the world were flown out to attend. But there was also another group present: Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and Tim Cook, the country's ultra-wealthy elites. And they were there for one thing: influence. In 2024, the world's 100 wealthiest families contributed $2.6 billion to political campaigns. The total spent in the presidential race was $512 billion, which means over half of the campaign money came from the country's richest families. For decades, the wealthy have used their wealth to fund political campaigns. But what exactly do they get in return? Well, they certainly aren't asking for higher taxes. Over time, they have managed to infiltrate the political system. Politicians depend on their wealth and funding to win elections, and in return, they promise to protect them. The result: US incomes are now more unequal than ever. CEO pay is now 290 times that of the average worker, up from 31 times in the 1980s. That's not because they're working 290 times harder, it's because the rules have changed to benefit those at the top. Executive compensation is padded with stock options, performance bonuses, and buybacks, all while wages for most workers barely keep up with inflation. Even if there was political will, actually taxing the wealthiest has become practically impossible. As part of the neoliberal project of the 80s, America allowed total capital mobility. This means that wealth that was created in the United States could be freely invested in other countries. Suddenly, living in America didn't mean your money had to stay there. For the rich, this changed everything. Investment opportunities across the world opened up in booming Asian markets, tax shelters in the Caribbean, and banking havens in Europe. Entire fortunes could now be moved offshore, hidden in complex webs of shell companies, trusts, and anonymous accounts well beyond the reach of American laws and taxes. Countries like Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Ireland offer practically zero tax rates and near total financial secrecy. Over the course of decades, trillions flowed out of the United States into these safe havens, and today, it's estimated that as much as 10% of the world's GDP is hidden offshore. As a result, taxing the rich has become basically impossible. If the US government were to try and do so, the money would just disappear, vanishing into foreign savings accounts. Because of this, for decades, the government has been totally complacent. The system just wasn't built to deal with inequality, and now the US has reached a breaking point. The bottom 50% of people own just 2% of the country's wealth, all while the rich keep earning more. The top 1% are now earning 139 times more than the poorest 20. The explosion in inequality hasn't just killed the American dream, it's actively pulling the country apart. Studies have shown that even a slight increase in the Gini coefficient, which measures income inequality, can lead to a noticeable rise in political polarization. Specifically, a shift of just 0.1 in the Gini coefficient can result in a 5% increase in the political divide. Since the 1960s, this measure of inequality in the US has surged by over 15%. This inequality doesn't just exist in numbers, it manifests in the everyday lives of ordinary Americans, and that growing divide has had a clear impact on the political climate. As inequality widened, political polarization followed suit. In the 60s, only 4% of Democrats and Republicans said that they would be upset if their child married someone from the opposite political party. Fast forward to 2019 and that number has skyrocketed. Now 45% of Democrats and 35% of Republicans say they would be displeased if their son or daughter married someone from the other side of the political aisle. America's political divide is no longer just about disagreement, it's tearing the country apart. Legislative gridlock has become the norm, while both parties stuck in their own echo chambers, unable to pass needed reforms. Social interactions are now defined by political lines, with families and communities fractured, and people retreating into their ideological corners. But while the left and right point fingers at each other, arguing over culture wars and identity politics, the rich keep getting richer. America now stands at a crossroads. The dream of opportunity, once a shining example to the world, is now clouded by an ever-growing divide between the rich and everyone else. The idea that anyone, no matter their background, could rise to the top is fading fast. All this raises the question, is there anything the country can actually do to fix this? Because, despite how broken the system seems, inequality isn't inevitable. It's a result of specific choices made over decades by people in power. Let's start with the most obvious option: taxes. Back in the mid-10th century, during America's so-called Golden Age, the top marginal rate of tax was over 90%. Today, it's just 37%. That didn't happen by accident. It was the result of relentless lobbying by the wealthy, sold to the public under the promise that lower taxes would stimulate growth. But decades of data shows the opposite. Lower taxes for the rich may boost the economy, but it comes at the expense of the working population. Reintroducing a more progressive tax system would rebalance the scales, ensuring that everyone got a share of economic growth. Of course, to have any success of actually passing tax reform, the country would first need to confront the excessive influence of money in politics. Campaign finance reform might be the single most important step toward fixing inequality. Right now, billionaires can effectively buy influence, bankrolling candidates who protect their wealth while ignoring the needs of ordinary voters. If America wants a democracy that truly reflects the will of its citizens, not just its donors, then the flow of money into politics has to be reined in. This means publicly funded elections, stricter donation caps, and transparent reporting, which could all help weaken the grip of the billionaire class. Once this is achieved, policies designed to directly reduce inequality, like universal healthcare, free college tuition, and a living minimum wage, become a real possibility. These aren't radical communist ideas. They're standard in most wealthy democracies, and they're also incredibly popular. In fact, most Americans already support higher taxes on the rich, stronger labor rights, and better public services. The problem isn't public opinion. It's that the system allows the powerful to ignore it. But change is still possible. History has shown that when inequality reaches unsustainable levels, societies are forced to act. The Gilded Age of the late 19th century gave way to the Progressive Era, and the Great Depression led to the New Deal. Even in the 1960s, civil unrest and activism forced massive political change. The question now isn't whether America can fix its broken system. It's whether it can find a way to rebuild it before it's too late. Because if things continue on its path, the damage will be irreversible and the promise of a better future will slip further out of reach.